I hope you've enjoyed studying about David for the past couple weeks, King David. And King David was one of the best rulers, one of the best kings that has ever walked the face of the planet. But yet we see that he messes up. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I get frustrated with our leaders because no matter how good they are, they either mess up or whatever change they put into place doesn't seem to last. So I'd like for us to start out this Bible study by asking two questions. What is it in the human heart that longs for a new ruler to fix the world? And what keeps rulers and leaders from bringing change that lasts? So I want you to start out the Bible study today by reading 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 10 through 16. And I want to ask you the question, how many promises does God make to David in these verses? No matter how many promises that you counted, I just want you to notice how God chooses to rule through a human being. Remember, several weeks ago, the people rejected God as their king because they wanted a human king. But then we find in David that God is willing to rule through a king. That's important when we think about Jesus Christ. What clues in these verses suggest that these promises to David ultimately point to another royal mediator? Two things I want you to notice. These verses are definitely talking about King David's son, Solomon. And Solomon becomes the wisest and richest king in the history of the nation of Israel. But when God uses the word forever, he is not exaggerating. He is referring to Jesus, because Jesus' reign will be forever. And a lot of times when we see these prophecies, there's a near prophecy and then there's a far prophecy. So within this prophecy, it is talking about David's son, the next king, King Solomon. But ultimately, it's talking about Jesus. Read 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 18 through 24. I want to ask you the question, what do David's questions say about his heart for God? And what do our ongoing struggles with pride and the need for control say about our understanding of the gospel? I want you to notice that when we fail to understand our continuing need of the gospel, we struggle with pride and control. So many times Christians fall into the trap of thinking that the gospel is just when I accepted Christ. And then we move on from that, and then we start looking a lot like the Pharisees. We start judging other people. And what we need to understand is that even though it may have been 20, 30 years since you've received Jesus as your Savior, we still need him just as much today as we always have. What also happens is that we end up having a too high a view of ourselves and too low a view of God. God said that he redeemed Israel to make a great name for himself. So how is God making a great name for himself through your life? Talk about that amongst your small group. But I also want to ask, are there any ways that we try to steal credit from God? Last question for this section. What are some of the ways that we can shape our lives in order to promote his credit instead of our credit? As we move on to our next passages, I want you to know that David's son Solomon eventually built the temple to God. David didn't have the opportunity to do that. He had it on his heart, but God said, no, I want your son to build it. And the temple represented God's presence in Israel at that time. So what I want you to do is read 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 54 through 61. What are Solomon's requests? And what are the motivations behind those requests? Does it seem strange that Solomon has to ask God for help in obeying him? Is it possible to obey God without his help? Why or why not? And how should Solomon's example of prayer in verse 58 affect our prayer lives? A few things that I want you to notice. We cannot obey God apart from God's help. It's impossible. Right? God has to help us to even obey him, which I know it sounds crazy, but that's how much we need him. A sinner, by very nature, sins. And you and I, we're still sinners. And what a sinner needs is for God to place a new nature within his or her heart. What I want you to do now is I want you to finish this small group lesson by praying that God would help us to obey him in our everyday lives. God bless you and have an awesome rest of the week.